The notification came through at 2:37 in the afternoon on a Thursday, and I almost didn't hear it over the drilling noise at the job site. I was 3 states away, outside of Boise, Idaho, doing a structural assessment on a grain elevator that a regional co-op was looking to expand. 14 years as a civil engineer, and I still took the field assignments nobody else wanted, because I've never been the kind of man who does his best work behind a desk. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat of the rental truck. I almost let it go to voicemail. It was my next-door neighbor, June. June Calloway is 74 years old and has lived in the same house on Sycamore Ridge Drive in Knoxville, Tennessee for 31 years. She baked my son a birthday cake every year without being asked. She knew his name, his teacher's name, his favorite color. When my wife and I were still together, June was the one who noticed my son's speech delay before either of us did. She's the kind of neighbor people don't deserve. "You need to come home," she said, and her voice sounded wrong. Not scared. Something worse than scared. Like she'd already moved past the fear into something quieter and colder. "Something's happening to Cooper. I can see it from my yard. I climbed up on the fence to look through the window, and you need to come home right now." I didn't ask questions. I already knew enough. I pulled up the home security app while she was still talking. I had 4 cameras inside the house, 2 that my ex-wife knew about, 2 that she didn't. I'd installed the hidden one 6 months ago after Cooper came home from a weekend visit with a bruise on his forearm that my ex-wife Sandra said was from falling off a bike. Cooper didn't have a bike at her place. I never said anything. I just started documenting. What I saw on that camera feed broke something open in my chest that I don't think has ever fully closed back up. My son is 8 years old. He has a mild form of sensory processing disorder, which means certain sounds, certain textures, certain situations overwhelm him in ways that aren't visible from the outside. He doesn't have meltdowns in public. He bottles it. He goes quiet and still, and his eyes get this particular look, like he's trying to disappear into himself. His therapist calls it shutting down. I call it the thing that happens when the world gets too loud for him, and he has no one safe to reach for. Cooper is terrified of the dark. Not in the way kids are generally scared of the dark. Clinically, genuinely terrified. We'd been working on it for 2 years with his occupational therapist. Even at home, he slept with 2 nightlights and a lamp on a timer. On the camera feed, I could see him in the hallway coat closet, the small one near the front door. It was completely dark. The crack under the door showed nothing. And I could hear him. Even through the audio feed, even with the compression and the static, I could hear him trying not to make noise and failing. That particular sound. That high, thin sound kids make when they've been crying so long their throat hurts. My ex-wife's younger brother, Terrence, was sitting on the floor in the hallway with his back against the closet door. He had his phone out, tilted so the screen faced toward the kitchen. I could see Sandra's cousin, a woman named Bryn, leaning in the kitchen doorway laughing at something. I couldn't see who else was in there. Terrence said, loud enough that the microphone caught it clearly, "I give him another 4 minutes before he starts begging." I had been a structural engineer for 14 years. Before that, I spent 6 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, deployed twice, once to Iraq and once to Afghanistan. I had assessed blown-out bridges in combat conditions. I had worked alongside EOD units in temperatures that fobbed your goggles. I had held my composure in situations that most people only see in movies. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set the phone down on the seat. I made 2 calls before I started the rental truck. The first was to my brother, Patrick. He lives in Maryville, 20 minutes from my house. He picked up on the second ring. I said 3 words, "Cooper, go now." He said, "On my way," before I finished the sentence. The second call was to a man named Voss. His full name is Theodore Voss, and we served together during my second deployment. He's the kind of person you meet in specific circumstances and realize immediately that the word friend is not going to be adequate for what you're becoming to each other. He now works private security consulting out of Nashville. He's 40 minutes from my house on a normal day. I said, "I need you at my house. Right now, I'll explain everything when I land." I booked a flight while I was still on the phone with him. The next departure out of Boise was in 40 minutes. I drove to that airport at speeds I am not going to put in writing. The flight was 2 hours and 11 minutes. I watched the camera feed for the first 40 minutes until the flight attendant made me put my phone in airplane mode. By then, I had watched the footage of Terrence checking his phone. of Bryn laughing, of Sandra walking past the closet door twice without stopping. I had watched my son's shadow visible only because June had managed to get the kitchen light on before she called me. I had counted 7 people in my house who were not my son and were not helping him. I watched it 41 times over those 40 minutes. Every single time it carved something new out of me. Patrick got there first. He texted me while I was still in the air. I didn't see it until I landed and turned my phone back on at the gate. The text said, "June got him out. He's okay. He's with June. Voss is here. Come home." I ran through Knoxville's McGee Tyson Airport carrying only my laptop bag. I hadn't packed anything. I had left my overnight bag, my work files, and my company truck at the job site in Idaho. Patrick was waiting at the curb. He didn't say anything when I got in. He just drove. Voss had arrived at the house 18 minutes after Patrick. June had already climbed back over the fence. This woman, 74 years old, had climbed a 6-foot privacy fence twice and had gotten the closet door open using a credit card on the interior latch that Terrence had wedged from the outside. She had Cooper in her kitchen with the lights on and a glass of apple juice and her old tabby cat on his lap before anyone in my house realized she'd taken him. By the time Patrick arrived, Voss was already standing in my front yard. I did not ask Voss what happened inside the house. I did not ask him to explain the condition Terrence was in when Knoxville PD arrived, or why 2 of Sandra's cousins had decided very suddenly that they needed to leave and had been located 3 blocks away sitting on a curb. I did not ask any of that. What I know is what was in the police report, which I have read many times, that officers arrived to find several individuals who declined to press charges for any injuries they may have sustained and who were subsequently arrested on child endangerment charges. Terrence was arrested on 2 counts. So was Bryn. Sandra was arrested in the driveway. She was still explaining, very loudly, that this had all been a misunderstanding, that she hadn't known Terrence was going to do that Cooper needed to learn to manage his anxiety. An officer I later learned was named Deputy Willis had to ask her 3 times to lower her voice. I got to June's house at 8053 that evening. Cooper was asleep on her couch with the tabby cat on his chest and every single light in the room on. June had wrapped him in a quilt that I recognized from her guest room. She met me at the door and put her hand on my arm and didn't say anything for a long moment. "He asked for you about every 10 minutes, she finally said. "I told him you were coming. I told him I promised." I sat on the floor next to the couch and put my hand near his so he could feel it without being woken up. He stirred after a few minutes and looked at me with the particular eyes kids get when they're not sure if they're still dreaming. "Dad?" "Right here," I said. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." He grabbed my wrist with both hands and held on, and I sat there on June's floor for a long time without moving. There are things Cooper told me over the following days that I am not going to write down here completely, because they belong to him, not to this story. What I will say is this: it had not been the first time. Not like that, not the full closet, but the build-up. The smaller cruelties that get dismissed as discipline. The comments about his sensory issues that Sandra's family called coddling and making him weak. The incidents that left no marks and that Cooper, because he is 8 and because he loves his mother in the complicated way that children love even people who hurt them, had not told me about because he was afraid I would be angry at her. He had been carrying it for months. The pediatric ER visit that night documented 4 things I hadn't known about: fading bruising on his left shoulder consistent with gripping, 3 older abrasions on his upper back, evidence of elevated cortisol levels consistent with chronic stress, and the beginnings of what the physician described as acute stress response from the closet incident. The attending physician, a woman who introduced herself only as Dr. Mwangi, asked me quietly at one point if I needed a moment. I said I was fine. I was not fine. But Cooper was watching me from the bed and I needed to be something steady for him to look at. While we were at the hospital, Voss sent me an encrypted message. "You're going to want to hear what's on the audio from the last 4 months. Not tonight, but soon." I had forgotten that in addition to the 2 hidden cameras, I had audio recorders in the main living areas. I had set them up in the same window of paranoia that had made me install the cameras. My military training had a long reach into my civilian life. The habit of documentation, the habit of always gathering more information than you think you need, because eventually you will need all of it. Patrick drove us to his house in Maryville that night. He had already set up the guest room and bought Cooper a new set of art supplies because Cooper draws constantly, always has elaborate technical drawings of buildings and bridges that at age 8 are frankly more sophisticated than some of the draftsmen I've supervised. His stepson, a 14-year-old named Jasper, gave Cooper his gaming headphones and taught him how to use them without asking anyone's permission, and that small act of kid kindness made me have to leave the room briefly. 2 days later, I sat in my truck in Patrick's driveway and listened to 4 months of audio recordings on my phone. I am going to share the part that matters most, because everything else, all the smaller cruelties and comments and moments I had missed, becomes context once you hear this. The recording was from 11 weeks ago. I had been in Ohio for a week-long job survey. Sandra's voice, her brother Terrence, and a third voice I recognized as her cousin Bryn, who worked as a paralegal and who Sandra had described to me for years as the smart one in the family. Sandra, the therapist, is the problem. As long as Cooper keeps seeing Dr. Finch, there's a paper trail. She documents everything he says. Terrence, so stop sending him. Sandra, I can't just stop sending him without. Ray would notice. Ray notices everything. That's the whole problem. Bryn, what you need is to establish a pattern. If Cooper's documented as emotionally unstable, if there's a clinical record of him acting out, having episodes, being unmanageable, you go back to court with that. You argue that the current custody arrangement is destabilizing him. Sandra, and I get more custody. Bryn, you get primary. Ray travels constantly for work. You argue that the instability is from the travel, from the inconsistency, that the kid needs a stable home base. You already have an attorney. You just need the documentation. Terrence, so what? We manufacture documentation. Bryn, we create conditions. If the kid is already anxious, you don't manufacture anything. You push the buttons that are already there, document his reactions, bring those to the therapist, and frame them as escalating episodes. Eventually, you've got a clinical professional signing off on what you're describing. Sandra, quietly, and the custody arrangement changes. Bryn, and the support arrangement changes too. Don't forget that part. I sat in that truck for a long time after the recording ended. I had suspected that something was wrong. I had installed cameras because something felt wrong. I had documentation going back 6 months because my instincts were telling me that the environment Cooper was in when I wasn't there was not safe. But hearing it laid out like that, hearing them discuss my 8-year-old son's diagnosed sensory disorder as a mechanism, as something to push and provoke, and then frame as evidence, I want to be careful about what words I use here. I want to be accurate. What I felt in that truck was the coldest I have ever been in my life. Colder than any field deployment. Colder than anything. I called Voss. I said, I need you to tell me everything you found. He had found more. Sandra had filed a motion with our family court 6 weeks prior requesting a custody modification. Her supporting documentation included notes from Cooper's school flagging increased emotional volatility in the classroom, notes that I later discovered were initiated after Sandra had a private meeting with the school counselor that she had not informed me of. The notes described 2 incidents where Cooper had struggled to regulate his responses to classroom situations. What the notes did not say, because the counselor had not known, was that those incidents had occurred the week after 2 separate weekends where, based on the audio recordings, Terrence had been in the house. It was all connected. The school counselor meeting, the manufactured incidents, the custody motion, the audio recordings, and Bryn, the paralegal, had been coaching Sandra on exactly how family court documentation worked, because she worked in it every day. I drove to the Knox County Family Court Self-Help Center the next morning and asked to speak with someone about filing an emergency motion. What I was told and what I want anyone in a similar situation to understand, you cannot walk into family court with audio recordings and expect the system to immediately correct itself. What you can do is secure competent legal representation immediately, which I did that afternoon. A woman named Patricia Osei, who had been doing family law in East Tennessee for 19 years, and who, when I played her 20 seconds of the Bryn recording, set her pen down and said, "Okay, we're moving fast on this." Patricia filed an emergency protective order that afternoon. She filed a motion to suspend Sandra's visitation pending investigation. She subpoenaed Sandra's phone records, Bryn's correspondence, and the school counselor's documentation. She also contacted the Tennessee Department of Children's Services, which opened its own investigation. Cooper stayed with Patrick. The DCS investigator, a woman named Ms. Torrance, interviewed Cooper twice with a trained child advocate present. She interviewed June Calloway, who described everything she had seen and heard on the day of the closet incident. She reviewed the medical documentation from the ER visit. She reviewed 4 months of audio recordings. She reviewed the security camera footage. Her report, which I was given a copy of weeks later, contained a phrase I have read many times. Evidence indicates a sustained pattern of deliberate exposure of the child to known sensory triggers, inconsistent with accidental or incidental harm, and consistent with intentional psychological distress. That report went to the district attorney's office. The criminal charges came down on a Tuesday. Sandra, 2 counts of child abuse, 1 count of custodial interference related to the school counselor documentation, 1 count of conspiracy. Terrence, 1 count of child abuse, 1 count of false imprisonment. Bryn, 1 count of conspiracy to commit child abuse, 1 count of obstruction related to her coaching on the documentation strategy. The charges were in the newspaper. I had not sought press coverage. Voss had not contacted anyone in the media. What happened was that June Calloway, 74 years old, retired elementary school librarian, gave one interview to a local television reporter who knocked on her door because the address was in the police report. June answered her door, invited the reporter in, gave her a cup of coffee, and explained, calmly and with precision, exactly what she had seen and done on the day she climbed a 6-foot fence twice to get my son out of a closet. The clip aired on the 6 o'clock news and was shared approximately 40,000 times in the first 24 hours. I wasn't watching television that week. I was at Patrick's house teaching Cooper how to play chess and letting him draw blueprints of imaginary skyscrapers and trying to figure out how to be normal while everything around us was anything but. Cooper asked me once during that time why his mom had let Terrence do that. He asked me in the car, which is where kids always ask the impossible questions because in the car you can't look at each other directly. I said, I don't know, buddy. I think she was scared of some things and made some really wrong choices because of it, but that was never about anything you did. That was never because of anything that's wrong with you. He thought about that for a minute and said, is the dark still scary if you know why you're scared of it? I said I didn't know. I said that was a good question. I said I thought knowing why might help eventually. He said, I think it might take a while. Me too, I told him. Me too. What happened next took several months to fully unfold, and I am going to tell it plainly because the details matter for anyone who needs to understand how these things actually work. Patricia Osei is one of the sharpest people I have ever encountered in any professional context. She approached the custody case the way a good engineer approaches a structural problem. Identify every load-bearing point. Test each one. Don't assume anything will hold until you've verified it. She found that Sandra had misrepresented her income on the original child support filing. She found that Bryn had advised Sandra on the misrepresentation, in writing, in an email that was captured in the subpoenaed records. She filed a motion for recalculation of child support that resulted in a judgment requiring Sandra to pay back 3 years of underpayment. The custody modification Sandra had filed was dismissed. Emergency full custody was awarded to me, pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. Eventually, it became permanent. Terrence took a plea deal, 18 months, with mandatory completion of a behavior intervention program. He'll serve 12 months in county. His attorney tried to characterize the closet incident as misguided discipline and an overreaction to the child's behavior. The assistant district attorney, a man named Whitfield who looked younger than I expected but spoke in court like someone twice his age, stood up and said that the defendant had blocked a closet door shut with a wedge, while an 8-year-old child with a documented sensory processing disorder was inside in complete darkness, had timed the child's distress response on his phone, and had used the word "before he starts begging" in reference to an 8-year-old. He said he would not be accepting characterizations of this as misguided discipline. Terrence got 18 months. Bryn lost her paralegal certification pending the criminal proceedings. She pled no contest to the conspiracy charge and received 3 years probation with community service. Whether she gets her certification back depends on a licensing board review that, as of when I'm telling this, has not yet concluded. Sandra's case went to trial. I am not going to detail the entire trial. What I will tell you is this: the jury heard the audio recordings. They heard the recording where Sandra said in her own voice, with full context, that she intended to push the buttons that are already there in her 8-year-old son in order to manufacture clinical documentation to support a custody modification. They heard Dr. Finch, Cooper's therapist, testify that the incidents Sandra's family had been presenting to her as escalating episodes were inconsistent with Cooper's baseline functioning and consistent with acute stress responses to external provocation. They heard Ms. Torrance from DCS describe her findings. Sandra's attorney argued that the recordings were taken out of context. He argued that Sandra was a mother who loved her child and had made mistakes under pressure. He was, by all accounts, doing his job with what he had, which was not much. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on the child abuse charges. Guilty on conspiracy. Guilty on the custodial interference count. When the verdict was read, Sandra did not break down the way I might have expected. She went very still and very pale. She looked at her attorney. Then she looked at the gallery, where her remaining family members were sitting, the ones who had not been charged, and the look on her face was something I have thought about many times since. It was the look of someone who has spent a long time convincing themselves that the story they were telling was true and has just run out of room to keep telling it. The sentencing came 5 weeks later. 4 years, with eligibility for parole at 2. Mandatory completion of a psychological evaluation program before any consideration of supervised visitation with Cooper, which would be determined separately and would require Cooper's own consent, given his age and the nature of the case. The judge, an older woman named Judge Aldrich, said from the bench, "This court has seen cases involving poor judgment, involving stress, involving parents who loved their children but failed them. This is not that case. This case involves deliberate, calculated exploitation of a child's documented vulnerability for the parent's own legal and financial advantage. This court finds no mitigating weight in the defendant's claimed affection for the child, because the evidence does not support that this child's well-being was ever the defendant's primary consideration." Cooper was not in the courtroom for the verdict or the sentencing. He was at school. He was at school because we had worked very hard, he and I and Dr. Finch and his new school's counselor and his teacher, a patient man named Mr. Chitts, Adkins, who had been teaching 4th grade for 22 years and who learned everything he needed to know about sensory processing disorder in the first 2 weeks of the school year and never once made Cooper feel like a problem, to be managed, to build something that felt normal, a routine, a day with a shape Cooper could trust. I drove him to school in the mornings. I was home when he got off the bus in the afternoons. I had restructured my work entirely. No more week-long field assignments, no more being 3 states away, no more trusting that the situation at home was fine because nothing had told me explicitly that it wasn't. My company had been accommodating more than I deserved. I took a role that was heavier on review and analysis work and lighter on travel, and I made up the difference in the hours I was home with my son. June Calloway came over for dinner every Thursday. Cooper started calling her Grandma June around month 3, and she pretended to be surprised, but I had seen her face when he first said it, and she was not surprised. She had been waiting. About 8 months after the trial ended, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a woman from a national child advocacy organization who had seen June's interview clip and had tracked down my contacts through Patricia Osei. She asked if I would be willing to speak at their annual conference about documentation, about the home security systems and audio recording, and the role that evidence gathering had played in the case. I said yes. I drove to Washington, D.C., and I stood in front of 400 people and told most of the story I've just told you. I talked about the cameras I installed because something felt wrong, and I didn't have words for it yet. I talked about the 6 months of documentation that built a case no attorney could dismantle. I talked about June Calloway climbing a fence twice. I talked about the moment in the car when Cooper asked me if the dark is still scary, if you know why you're scared of it. A woman in the 3rd row started crying and didn't stop. After the conference, a man came up to me who introduced himself as a social worker from Ohio. He said he had a case, several cases, where the documentation situation was exactly what I described. Parents feeling something wrong but not knowing how to capture it in a way the system would recognize. He asked if he could stay in touch. He does. He emails me every few months with updates. Last I heard, he had helped 3 families in his district set up documentation systems based on what I described. I don't know if I saved anyone. I know that Cooper is 9 now. He likes 4th grade. He still draws elaborate building blueprints, and Mr. Adkins has started letting him present them to the class as art projects, and apparently his classmates think they're cool, which is the most 4th grade possible outcome, and the one I'm most grateful for. He still uses a nightlight. He's working on it, slowly, at his own pace. Dr. Minting. Finch says he's making real progress. He slept through the night without waking up for the first time 4 months after the trial ended. He came into my room in the morning and told me, very seriously, that he had slept all the way through, and he seemed uncertain whether this was good news or strange news. I told him it was good news. He said, "I think I'm getting better." I said, "I think so too, buddy." He went back to his room to draw. If you are watching this and you recognize something in Cooper's story, something in that feeling of things being not quite right that you can't yet name, please hear me. Document everything. Security cameras, audio logs, medical records, school communications, everything. Keep copies in more than one place. If a child tells you something feels wrong, believe them and then help them prove it in the language the system understands, because that language is evidence, and evidence is what changes outcomes. The National Child Abuse Hotline is 1-800-422-4453. They are available 24 hours a day. If a child is in immediate danger, call 911. If you are in a custody situation where you suspect something is wrong, contact a family law attorney before you do anything else, and document the conversation you have with them. Document everything. Speak up, because the people who hurt children are counting on the fact that you won't. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in any abstract way, just in the plain mechanical way that an engineer thinks about it. Every structure stands or falls based on what was built into it, layer by layer, decision by decision, long before anyone notices a crack. Sandra didn't become the person who locked Cooper in that closet overnight. Neither did Terrence. Neither did Bryn, who sat in her paralegal office and drafted a strategy for exploiting an 8-year-old's diagnosed condition like it was a deposition outline. These things build slowly, the way structural failures always do. Small allowances. Small rationalizations. The first time someone in that family dismissed Cooper's sensory needs as drama, they made the next dismissal easier. The first time Sandra chose what she wanted over what he needed, she made the next choice easier. By the time they were sitting around my house, timing my son's suffering, they had told themselves a story for so long that they believed it. That's the part that stays with me. Not the cruelty of what they did, the ordinary sequence of choices that got them there. I had my own sequence of choices that got them there. 6 months of something feeling wrong and not knowing what to do with that feeling. I installed cameras because my instincts were telling me something, and I almost talked myself out of it twice because I didn't want to be the kind of person who installs hidden cameras, but I did it anyway. I kept the audio recorders running when I was away. I documented every bruise, every incident, everything that felt slightly off. I did it quietly without telling anyone because I wasn't sure yet what I was preparing for. That documentation is what saved Cooper. Not my anger, which was considerable, not Voss, though I will be grateful for him for the rest of my life. The recordings, the timestamps, the chain of evidence that Patricia Osei turned into a case that Sandra's attorney couldn't touch. Every choice I made to write something down, to save something, to keep a copy in a second location. Those choices compounded the same way Sandra's choices did, just in the opposite direction. Cooper asked me once if he was going to be okay. He asked it plainly, the way kids ask things, without any of the hedging adults put around hard questions. I said yes. I said it because I believed it, but also because I had watched him draw floor plans at the kitchen table for an hour that same morning, completely absorbed, completely himself, and I knew that whatever they had tried to break in him was still there. It had bent. It had not broken. That's the thing about resilience that nobody tells you. It isn't something you have or don't have. It's something that gets built, the same way everything else does. slowly, through the accumulation of safe mornings and patient adults and small dignities that nobody took away. Mr. Adkins letting Cooper present his blueprints to the class. June making room on the couch for a boy who needed somewhere to land. Patrick buying 3 boxes of a cereal Sandra had always said was too much sugar. Those things are not small. Those things are the structure. Those things are what holds. I don't think Sandra understood that what she was trying to destroy in Cooper was not a weakness she could manipulate. It was exactly the quality she should have been protecting. His sensitivity is not a liability. It is the reason he notices things other people miss. It is the reason his drawings have so much detail. It is the reason he asked me at age 8 whether the dark is still scary if you know why you're scared of it, which is a better question than most adults think to ask about anything. He's getting better. Slowly, at his own pace, on his own terms. And I think that's the only honest answer to how recovery works. Not all at once, not on a schedule, just forward, one safe morning at a time.